My name is Brandon Harrison, and I'm the Associate Features Programmer for Doc NYC. I'm very pleased to welcome our director, Ursula Liang, and editor Jason Harper from Down a Dark Stairwell. Welcome to both of you guys for joining us and sharing your film with Doc NYC.
Thank you for having us. I'm always really excited to be around, near, and part of Doc NYC.
Likewise.
Love it, love it, love it. I'll just dive right in because I love the film, and of course, being in New York, very important project. I'm curious, when handling a story this prominent and with a lot of different emotional ties to it. How do you go about developing your filmmaking team to approach a project like this?
It was a little daunting because the last film I made, which also played at Doc NYC, Nine Man, it was a story that no one had told. And this one was one that if you were in New York, you heard about it. You saw it in the New York Times every day. I think I thought that the coverage didn't quite reflect all the things that I knew and the point of view that I saw things from coming from my community. So part of what I was interested in doing and telling the story was making sure that that I could pair sort of the historical context and the sort of the perspective of where I come from to the story. And I thought that that was still what wasn't being told, and that we were really interested in digging a little deeper and getting to sort of the street level conversations that were happening rather than the sort of shouting that was going on in the street. And it was very important in building the team because, I wanted the team to reflect the communities that I know. And we made sure that our creatives were all people of color and actually Black and Asian. And I think that was a crucial component into getting a different story than what the major media was covering.
I wanted to touch on that when you say hearing the different voices. As a filmmaker making a film about something that it's in prominent media, how important was it for you to include, Chinese language media in your archival and your news clips? I thought that was really well done, and it gave a different lens than you normally see in these sorts of films.
Well, I mean, I think when you work in popular media, there's a lot of fear of covering the Asian community because there's a fear of the language barrier. And I have that same fear. I don't speak Chinese. So I go into these spaces, but I also keep the camera rolling and make sure that we know what's going on when we get back to the edit room. I thought once I started realizing how much of this story from the Chinese perspective was affected by the social and political and news bubble that the non-native English speaking community is part of, I realized that it was definitely an important component. There were folks that were reading Chinese newspapers and they were, keeping up with the news every day, but that they weren't aware of the larger Black Lives Matter movement until this story hit the community in specific. And so that was sort of mind-blowing to me to know that the Eric Garner case, which had happened 4 months before, was not like hugely on the radar of this community while it was on the radar of the entire country. So Jason, I was really excited to have Jason on board because a lot of the treatment and physical treatment of all that stuff came into play in the edit. And I also think, it adds a lot of visual texture to the film.
Yeah, I wanted to commend that as well. I love the way that was handled, especially going into things like testimony. All of these graphical elements were amazing. How did you decide on this? I don't want to call it a vignette style, but you have so many different characters that you're, navigating their perspectives on this incident. How did you approach that, both, as the director and in the edit?
It just presented a huge problem for Jason and Michelle in the edit. But I think I have a hard time not listening to lots of little stories. I think I'm one of those people with just one of those crazy brains, and I have I have trouble focusing in general. So for me, it was very interesting to see how all the folks were reacting to the story, and it was also very important to our collaborators. Chanel Aponte Pearson is a great producer director. She was part of the project early on, and she. Like folks on the Asian side were saying, our communities are really seen in these very monolithic ways. We don't have the right kind of diverse representation on screen. And so it sort of takes a chorus of voices to be able to unpack that monolithic point of view that people have of our community. So you need to show the different folks and how the nuances of their opinions really shape their thoughts on these subjects. Jason, maybe you want to talk about how much I tortured you in the edit with all.
Well, I think it's a good sort of torture, because basically what you're doing is like you're dealing with fragments of society that make up a whole. And what I think it speaks towards is something that you see, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement today. What you have is a decentralized group of people, really on both sides, but with the Asian American community and with the African American community. There are certainly leaders who kind of rise above, and you see their names. But I guess in answer to your question, there's no monolithic single person you can point to and say they represent this entire community. Not on the Black side, not on the Asian American side, and finding a way to tell both parts of those stories with equity and to give the appropriate amount of time to the many characters that are throughout the documentary was a needle that I think Ursula very smartly was able to thread. And so, yeah, it was in service of that mission that the style came about, and vignetting, as you say, the different characters. That's how that came to be.
And Ursula, how did you actually maintain these relationships and build these relationships with all these people? And there's a lot of very intimate conversations going on. Were there any unforeseen difficulties or surprises? How did that come together?
I don't know. It's all part of the work of being a director. I thought it was very difficult. It was one of the most difficult things about making the film. It was clear to me early on that I wanted to tell the story from multiple points of view, and so I made sure that was clear to the subjects, and they didn't like it. You know, everybody wants an advocacy story where their point of view is the main point of view, and you nod to the other thing. But you know, being honest with people is important, and making sure they're set up for what's to come. And you know, I was very specific about who I brought with me in the field when I went to speak to people. When I went to speak to Kai Gurley's family members for the first time, I just showed up to a street protest, and his aunt was there speaking, and I was with Lyra Cabral. She was helping me out in the field, and you know, we just asked her on the first day whether we could put a microphone on her, and she let us put a microphone on her and travel around the pink houses where her nephew was killed. And there was sort of an openness to media. I think the Black community and the activist community understands that there's an important role that media plays in bringing the story to different communities. I mean, this now, of course, our film doesn't affect the outcome of the case, but it does open the door to a longer term discussion, to remembering a kind of different way in the future, and to bringing this story to like a very different audience than it was hitting at that time. So, you know, I found the Asian American community a little bit more difficult to access. I think that our community is used to not being seen in the media. So like every single portrait of us in the media, we want to make sure it's exactly right and exactly perfect. And so there's more of a fear. And a lot of these folks are coming from a place where the media is controlled by the state. So, so I think it takes a little bit more finesse to get into that community. But I had made a film in Chinatown for 7 years before this. So I did have a lot of contacts that led me to the right people. And in the Chinese community, I think a lot of it is relationship based. You know, you being introduced to somebody else is really a huge component of accessing that community. But it was hard.
You can see that in these particular scenes, which I feel are paralleled, and it's happening so much. You have these rallies, but you also have the meetings, the organizational meetings before the rallies. You have the courtrooms on both sides, the interviews. How did you approach handling that visually on location, and your process doing that on location? And once again, Jason, what was it like for you and your team to handle that and put it together for the actual completed film?
Well, I definitely want to shout out citizen journalists, folks that just get out into the street and start filming things, because we actually started filming this story quite late in the process. And we were able to tap into the amazing work of citizen journalists who've been following things earlier. So some of what you see, I want to definitely give credit where credit is due, is also due to the access to some of these folks that just decided to take out their cameras and jump in there. And they're both filmmakers who made shorter films, and people who work in the news, but they're just out there in the streets recording because they want to record. So shout out to those folks. Thank you for coming on board and helping us make our film. Jason, did you want to talk about the edit?
Yeah, I think in terms of what Ursula shot, there's a pretty distinct difference between the footage that she captured after and what we were piecing together from the citizen journalists. And in a way, that's the language of the film that starts with this kind of jumble of iPhone footage, footage captured on a DSLR, whatever citizen journalist was using as the medium that they had available. Eventually, that kind of chaos of different visuals then synthesizes into a single voice that the film finds, which is what Ursula was able to go out and capture and do the sit-down interviews, et cetera, and then trace the journey of the trial. And in a way, I think there's probably a way that cinematic language mirrors what was happening in the culture as all these disparate voices began to speak as one in their own ways, and like a narrative came out, was able to sort of rise from that. And so, yeah, it was tricky because it was just so many different types of archive. But ultimately, what matters, is the story and that coming through. And I think people or audiences are pretty forgiving of what it looks like, as long as the message rings true and rings through. So yeah, it was a good journey.
Shout out to all of our assistant editors and APs who helped wrangle that mess of stuff too.
Absolutely.
It's awesome. You guys alluded to it a little earlier. I mean, this is a New York story that's touching on a tenuous racial dynamic that it's known but not discussed. What would you say that your film, what would you want people to take away from your film about the way racial dynamics in New York City have been expressed over the years and going forward?
Oh, that's a big question. I do hope that people will take different things away from the film depending on what their point of view is walking into the film. We definitely wanted people to think about solidarity, and New York is a very physically diverse place. You pass everybody in the world on the street when you're walking, but we still have a lot of very siloed communities. Chinatown is a perfect example of that. It was a community that was started in response to like racist policy and laws, and to self-protect the community, but then it became a self-isolated community. And you've got multiple, Chinatowns in New York now, in a Flushing community that's really like linguistically isolated. But you can do everything within your own community. And I think that, I guess in some ways there's a lot of that happening in the world right now. It's not just the Chinese community, it's not just the Black community. There are, rural white communities that are doing it too. It's like so many pieces of our country right now are sort of pocketed into these spaces where we only care about things that happen to our community because we're in such a place of insecurity that we don't feel like we can even think about the other communities. And I think I want to challenge that notion. I think in this story, you're seeing that both the Asian American and the Black community have very, very specific issues that they're dealing with, and a lot of fights that need to go forward to, fight against the oppressive like structures that exist. But I don't know if we can all do it alone. I think we're seeing now in this moment, this new uprising that's happened over the last few months, that that sort of allyship and solidarity are really important to moving things forward. That's not the only thing I hope people take away from the film, but I think it's an important underlying current of the story.
Do you have anything to add about that, or?
No, I think she put that very well. Hopefully, in the final moments of the film, that becomes clear that although we fought very hard throughout the edit, sometimes, we just fought for balance along the way. But hopefully, in the final notes of the film, what lingers is exactly that idea that although our communities are different and struggle differently, there is an overarching struggle that we both share in, and solidarity gets us further along than trying to do it alone.
I just wanted to ask you guys this last question, and it's about solidarity, because that was one of my things I had underlined so many times, and you brought it up. But in the film, you had these situations where all of these individuals, they feel this pull of what is the right thing to do? Are they doing the right thing? What does it mean? How did you guys want to craft that on screen? And ultimately, like, what does solidarity mean?
That's another big question. You're coming with the big question.
Big questions.
You know, what does it mean? I think it means a lot of different things. It doesn't mean like agreeing on everything. It in some ways it means having common goals, and those can be very small goals. You know, we tried to like drop some hints along the film. You know, you see in our film like mentions of Asian Americans also having violence by the, you know, violence from the police, and you know, that's not talked about a lot. But it is a point of commonality. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's even not, it has nothing to do with the issues at hand, but it has to do with the fact that we all want, you know, we all want our communities to be respected. I don't know. I mean, I think it's so many different things. Jason's usually wiser than me. Jason, do you have a good answer for this one? Because I'm having trouble.
The answer, I mean, it's just a kind of a question that, you know, Plato could have very easily and probably did ask around like, what are these things that the definitions of which we very easily take for granted, and they can become sort of buzzwords if we don't stop and consider them. I think it's really wrapped up in some of the signs that you see people carrying through the documentary, that we were very explicit in the edit about what we were showing when. A sign, for example, during one of their rallies in support of Peter Liang from the Asian American community, might say, you know, that there are 2 victims here. A sign saying something to the matter of like 1 crime, 2 victims, and really not just the paradox of that. That how can you have 2 victims when an event like that happens? Forces a very like, yeah, forces a philosophical kind of reckoning of like, what does it mean to be holding hands together on something like this? And in the end, yeah, sometimes we only understand in retrospect what that means, and that means like in the final moments of the film, again, going back and looking at what has solidarity looked like over the course of American history, who are the figures of that, how can we kind of try to swim through it, and in the end, be able to retroactively look back and say, okay, maybe we're doing something right if we can get to an end result that is equitable, with the realization that I don't think justice is something that can be cleanly defined with an event like this. And maybe that's just a tough realization that I think the doc tries to come to terms with.
Yeah, Jason brings up a really good point in that in this film, language is very important. And a lot, you know, you're asking us to define solidarity in some ways, and it's hard for even Jason and I, as educated English-speaking people, to define it. A lot of the themes in the film, you know, like white supremacy, structural oppression, all this stuff, those are big ideas. And when you're talking about trying to organize and have solidarity with a community that, you know, I think 40 to 60% are you know, not 100% English proficient, sometimes we need to think about how we're going to hold hands and how we're going to get through this together. And sometimes that's unpacking some of these things into and meeting people where they are, because these big concepts are very hard for people to understand. And we now at this point, they're so much part of the language that we're just throwing them around. But I think people need to sort of move back a little bit and get to like, you know, more detailed and fundamental examples of what these things mean, so that we can move forward together. Because I think we're sort of talking over people and not having them really feel and understand what this all means and what's at stake.
I think the film did an excellent job of highlighting those nuances a number of times, and those conversations that were meeting people where they are. So I really enjoyed it. I want to thank both of you guys for joining us today, Ursula Liang and Jason Harper. Thanks guys so much for Down a Dark Stairwell.
Thank you, Brandon.